Willow Creek lay tucked among sprawling maple groves and dusty back roads, a town so quiet that the slam of a window could draw a neighbor to the porch within seconds. Each morning, white picket fences, hanging flower baskets on porches, and the scent of cinnamon waffles drifting from the corner bakery painted a picture so gentle that people believed it would never change. But then Sophie Miller arrived, a 7-year-old girl with large brown eyes as silent as dawn mist, her red canvas sneakers tapping softly along the worn stone path. Since the day a cruel accident took her parents away, Sophie hadn't spoken a single word to anyone. Everyone in Willow Creek knew this. They also knew she now lived with her grandparents, Henry and Linda Miller, in a weathered timber house at the far end of Maple Lane. Yet what the townsfolk whispered about most was not Sophie's silence, but the 6 towering German shepherds that never left her side. At daybreak, while the sun still lingered shyly behind the tree line, Sophie would appear on the front porch. 6 shadowy figures lining up behind her. No leashes, no shouted orders. A mere flick of her small hand set the whole pack into motion, moving as though they were extensions of her own quiet body. To some, it looked like a gentle miracle. To others, it was a quiet promise of trouble yet to come. Before everything fell apart, the Miller family was the quiet pride of Willow Creek. Ethan Miller and his wife, Rachel, were well known across the region as gifted dog trainers, specializing in preparing German shepherds for search and rescue missions in snowstorms and wilderness accidents. Whenever there was an emergency, a child lost in the forest, a blizzard swallowing up hiking trails, local police and rescue teams would call the Millers first, and by their sides, at least 3 shepherds stood ready like loyal sentinels. For 6-year-old Sophie, life was a blur of wagging tails, tufts of fur stuck to the carpets, and nights falling asleep to the soft clink of leashes hanging by the mudroom door. Her parents often joked that Sophie understood dogs better than people. A faint growl or a tilt of a furry head, and she knew instantly which one was hungry, which one wanted the thrill of a midnight run. No one knew then that these simple, instinctive understandings would someday become her only lifeline to the living world. The accident came on a damp October evening. A drizzle misted the highway connecting Willow Creek to the neighboring town, and a film of cold fog blurred the windshield. Ethan drove, Rachel dozed in the passenger seat, and Sophie, buckled safely in the back, hugged her worn-out teddy bear. They were heading home after 3 long days training with a local rescue crew. No one expected a car to barrel through a red light with just enough speed to turn everything into a single streak of shattered glass and silence. Ethan and Rachel died on impact. When paramedics arrived, they found Sophie motionless in the back seat, tangled among scattered bags and loose leashes. Miraculously, her body bore no serious injuries, only a few shallow scratches. But when a nurse gently lifted her out, Sophie's wide eyes stared unblinking into nothing, her lips pressed shut as if a door had swung closed deep inside, locked from within. In the weeks that followed, Sophie spoke not a single word. Doctors at the county hospital called it selective mutism, a shielded place in her mind where grief could not break her completely. Henry and Linda took their granddaughter home, along with the 6 shepherds Ethan and Rachel had raised like trusted comrades. Ranger, the commanding leader; Daisy, gentle to the bone; Thor, strong yet obedient to a fault; Blitz, quick-minded and sly; Ember, patient as a summer oak; and Scout, still young enough to prefer chasing butterflies over guarding the door. At first, Henry considered giving away a few of the shepherds to Ethan's old colleagues. He and Linda were both past 70, and caring for 6 large working dogs plus a mute, grief-stricken child seemed impossible. But one morning he stood frozen at Sophie's bedroom door. She lay on the carpet, the entire pack sprawled around her, each massive head resting gently on a part of her small body, eyes half shut, breath steady. a living wall of warmth guarding her sleep. Henry could only step back and close the door as quietly as his old hands would allow. From that moment on, he knew only these dogs could keep what was left of Sophie's spirit from slipping away. No one ever taught Sophie how to signal Ranger or Daisy what to do. She had never sat through one of her parents' long training drills, never learned the official commands Ethan used in the snow-covered woods with the search team. Yet somehow Sophie just knew, and the shepherds knew her just the same. At first, it was a simple, gentle stroke down Ranger's spine whenever he rumbled a warning growl at a stranger leaning too close to the fence. A slight shake of her head or a soft nod, and the entire pack hushed, retreating to the shady corner of the yard without protest. When Daisy lay curled at Sophie's feet on the porch, a quiet sniff or a quick snap of Sophie's fingers sent Daisy bounding up to herd Blitz and Scout away from their rough play. Every morning, just as dawn pressed its first pale light over the rooftops, Henry would stand hidden behind the living room curtain, peeking at his granddaughter and her 6 silent guardians trailing down the creaking wooden steps. Sophie always took the lead. Ranger matched her stride on the right, Thor on the left. Daisy and Blitz formed a careful middle flank, while Ember and Scout brought up the rear, eyes flicking watchfully at every rustle along the roadside hedges. No one ever heard Sophie utter a word, but the observant could see her hands dancing slightly in the air, a bent finger to signal a pause, a slow twist of her wrist for a turn. And just like that, 6 loyal shadows shifted and glided in perfect response to a language no one had taught, a language only she and her shepherds spoke. In the beginning, Sophie kept her silent patrols close to home, looping along the dirt path behind the old barn, far from Main Street and watchful eyes. Slowly, as Henry noticed her finishing more than a spoonful of soup, sleeping through a whole night without waking from hidden terrors, he knew he had to let Sophie open her own door, in her own way. So he stepped back and never blocked her quiet adventures as they crept further and further from the porch. Neighbors soon noticed. Some stiffened at the sight, 6 towering shepherds unleashed, moving like a domesticated wolf pack at the command of a speechless child. Others found themselves pausing by their picket fences, a soft smile tugging at their lips as they watched Sophie, the mute girl whose eyes now flickered with a spark they had not seen since the funeral. Children giggled from behind their parents' legs, whispering, "The dog witch girl," while the old-timers shook their heads, muttering, "Trouble's bound to come of this. You'll see." Sophie never cared. Each step she planted on the old stone lane seemed to carry a new breath of life, lighter than the one before. And every dawn, while the windows of Willow Creek still held the last of the night's mist, folks would glance through parted curtains to catch a glimpse of that tiny figure at the head of a silent pack of gray and gold fur, moving through the fog like keepers of an unspoken secret, one known only to Sophie and her shepherds. Among those who glimpsed Sophie each morning, none watched as long or as intently as Margaret Pierce. She had been Willow Creek's elementary school teacher for 40 years, known for her strict fairness and the iron certainty in her voice, a certainty that still held weight even after retirement. Margaret now lived quietly with her husband Walter in a white-painted house perched right on the corner of Hawthorne Street, the very street Sophie and her silent pack walked down at dawn. At first, Margaret simply stood behind the curtain, morning tea in hand, observing how Sophie moved. Slow, head lowered, 6 German shepherds gliding like shadows. No leashes, no muzzles. She would never deny it looked beautiful, but beautiful did not mean safe. Order is safety, Margaret often reminded Walter as they sat at the breakfast table. Walter would only grunt, flipping his newspaper, never arguing. He had long grown used to his wife brand of careful worry that sometimes crossed into stubbornness. But Margaret could not let it go. In her mind, she replayed the image of 6 powerful dogs, each 100 pounds of muscle, spooked by a sudden car horn yanking Sophie into the street, or a curious child running up to pet one, only to be knocked to the pavement. Each imagined accident stabbed at her thoughts like a sewing needle pricking through fabric that would never mend. And so, Margaret began to act. She attended the next town council meeting and stood to speak. "I do not say Sophie Miller is a bad child," she began, her voice unwavering. "I say we are burdening her with something dangerous, and in doing so, risking the safety of us all." A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Some nodded slowly, others stared at her as if she had stepped on a fairy tale too lovely to question. Undeterred, Margaret printed flyers herself and posted them on the doors of the general store, the bakery, and every lamppost on Main Street. "For the safety of our children, protect Sophie Miller and Willow Creek from preventable tragedy." Below the bold words was her phone number for anyone who wanted to talk or add their name to her cause. Margaret invited neighbors onto her wraparound porch for coffee and cookies she baked herself. She poured sweet tea and spoke gently. "I don't blame Sophie. She's a dear child, truly. But ask yourselves this: when something goes wrong, who will carry that blame? Who will pick up the pieces?" At first, only 3 or 4 people came. By the second week, the porch brimmed with concerned faces. They murmured, nodded, and eventually, one by one, signed the petition Margaret kept tucked under her arm like a lesson plan she never quite set down. Inside Margaret, reason and unease waged a silent war. Each night she sat by her window watching Sophie slip past the streetlight's glow, 6 ghostly shapes keeping pace. Her eyes stung, but her mouth stayed firm. She told herself, "I am doing right. This is how I protect the town, and this is how I protect that child too." Margaret's flyers and the growing whispers spread through Willow Creek faster than news of a summer thunderstorm. Within 2 weeks, more than 30 signatures lined the bottom of her petition. Parents fretted, once indifferent neighbors now emailed and called the town council. Willow Creek was not used to loud disputes, much less a public clash like this. Old Mayor Andrews, weary of the tension, finally ordered an urgent hearing and invited professionals to assess the truth behind the worry. One crisp morning in early March, with patches of melting snow still clinging to front yards, a silver sedan rolled to a quiet stop in front of the Miller home. Stepping out were Dr. Samuel Bennett, a respected child psychologist specializing in trauma, and Claire Rodriguez, a veteran caseworker from the Department of Family Services. Linda opened the door, her voice soft and tremulous. "Sophie's in the living room with the Shepherds. She doesn't like strangers. Please keep your voices low." Dr. Bennett and Claire stepped into the old timber house, the door creaking in greeting before shutting firmly behind them. On a worn carpet in the center of the room, Sophie sat cross-legged, shoulders hunched, brown hair veiling half her face. 6 shepherds ringed her in a near-perfect crescent. Ranger pressed close, ears high, eyes locked on every movement the visitors made. Silence weighed heavy across the room. No one dared break it. Claire exhaled slowly and dipped her head in a silent greeting to Sophie. Dr. Bennett did not reach for his clipboard. Instead, he simply watched. The rhythm of her breath, the flick of her fingers drumming lightly on Ranger's back. Over the next few days, the team was allowed to observe Sophie's daily life. They recorded how she fed the dogs, brushed their coats, adjusted their collars. Every cue was silent, a twist of her wrist, a deliberate blink. Thor moved from doorway to window with just the tap of Sophie's fingernail against the wooden floor. Daisy fetched a dishcloth from the kitchen without a single spoken word. Then the unexpected happened. On Wednesday morning, Linda was pouring tea when she heard a heavy, dragging step and an unfamiliar rasping gasp. Henry staggered into the doorway, his face drained of all color. Before Linda could cry out, Ranger shot to his feet, bursting out of the shepherd circle like a fired bullet. He didn't bark, He pressed close to Henry, guiding him gently to the floor so he wouldn't hit his head. Sophie sprang forward, wide-eyed, her hands flicking rapid commands to Blitz and Thor, who immediately took positions by the door. Linda, hands trembling, dialed 911, her heartbeat hammering as she watched Ranger lie across Henry's chest, nudging his palm 3 times as if to insist he keep breathing. Dr. Bennett murmured to Claire, barely above a whisper, "You see that? This dog didn't just obey, he anticipated." That afternoon, a veterinary behaviorist confirmed what they had witnessed. Ranger displayed signs of innate stroke and seizure alert abilities, an exceptionally rare instinct that few shepherds could ever be trained to mimic. What had begun as a question of safety had evolved into something far more complex. A living bond that defied regulations and textbooks, a raw empathy no policy could quite measure. When word spread that Ranger had an innate medical alert ability, the tension in Willow Creek did not fade. It bubbled hotter than ever. Supporters of Sophie hailed it as a miracle the town should cherish. Detractors, led fiercely by Margaret Pierce, doubled down. This only proves the girl can't truly control them. Dogs have instincts. Instincts cannot be trusted blindly. Arguments swirled, emails flooded the town council's inbox, and local blogs posted eye-grabbing headlines. Willow Creek on edge. Who's watching the dog witch girl? There was no avoiding it now. An official hearing was scheduled. The date, Monday, 8 a.m. at Willow Creek Town Courthouse. That morning, a heavy mist clung to the streets, breath hanging in frosty clouds as people lined up at the courthouse steps. Inside, the courtroom brimmed to the walls. Neighbors, reporters, parents, the merely curious, and plenty whose signatures sat at the bottom of Margaret's petition. In one corner, Sophie sat small and still beside her grandparents. Ranger pressed close to her feet, his eyes wide, calmly tracking each flicker of movement across the sea of murmuring faces. Sophie hadn't spoken a word since arriving. Her tiny fingers curled tightly into the soft fur at Ranger's ruff, as if clutching the last strand connecting her to the world. Margaret Pierce sat across the aisle, her back ironed straight with the posture of a teacher who had never quite stepped out of the classroom. Her eyes flicked from Sophie to Henry to the bench where the judge would soon sit. At her side, a local attorney clutched a folder stuffed with a petition now boasting over 50 signatures. Judge Mariana Ochoa entered at last, hair neatly pinned back, her voice low yet firm. The restless whispers in the room vanished in an instant. Claire Rodriguez was called first. She recounted her days observing Sophie, how the mute child commanded the shepherds with silent signals alone, how Ranger's medical alert behavior had been verified. A ripple of awe swept the courtroom as Claire played video footage. Sophie snapping her fingers, the 6 shepherds instantly forming a protective circle in the middle of an intersection. Next, Dr. Bennett rose, notes untouched. "This is not a standard pet owner dynamic," he said calmly. "It is a bi-directional system. Sophie is not merely giving orders. She and these dogs co-create a private language." Margaret's knuckles whitened around her folded hands. Her lawyer stood, voice sharpened like a blade. A mute child, 6 working shepherds not trained for civilian pet life, no leashes, an undeniable, reckless risk to this community. Finally, Judge Ochoa leaned forward, her steady eyes meeting Sophie's across the crowded room. "Miss Sophie Miller, only if you wish it, do you have anything you'd like to say to the court today?" Not a single sound stirred the air. Linda bent close, whispering softly into Sophie's ear. The child didn't answer. Her shoulders trembled once. Ranger nudged his head firmly against her knee, his gaze saying, "Go on." "Ranger!" The words slipped out like a long withheld breath, torn free from years locked inside her ribs. The courtroom froze in a silence so fragile, It felt like glass underfoot. Margaret Pierce, who for decades had clung to rules and boundaries, felt her heart collapse around her ribs. Sophie's hands trembled, clutching tight at the thick fur around Ranger's neck. Her eyes were wet, rimmed with red, but unwavering. Ranger lay steady at her feet, ears pricked forward, eyes flicking from Margaret to Sophie and back again, a living promise. "You're not alone." Sophie's voice broke, quivering like a bird in a storm. "When the accident, the car rolled, fire everywhere. I couldn't scream. I heard my mama's voice, then nothing. Ranger, he bit my seatbelt. Ranger, he found me. When the fire came, he didn't stop, even when it burned him. He saved me." A soft gasp cracked the hush. Linda sobbed openly. Henry bowed his head into shaking hands. Dr. Bennett's knuckles whitened on the bench. Claire Rodriguez pressed a tissue to her wet cheek. Sophie hunched forward, shoulders trembling. Instantly, Thor, the broad-shouldered shepherd, stepped ahead of her, planting himself between Sophie and the staring crowd, eyes narrow, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. Daisy pressed her muzzle under Sophie's arm, warm and insistent. Ranger licked her knuckles gently, then gave a soft, urgent whine. "Go on. You can do this." Sophie lifted her tear-slick eyes to the room, her words sharp as blades cut from pain and truth. "After that, I was scared of fire, of horns, of everything. But when Daisy licks my hand, I stop shaking. When Blitz sleeps against my back, there's no fire in my dreams. Scout brings Mama's teddy bear every night. Ember sits at my door, keeps nightmares out. Thor and Ranger, they growl if anyone scares me." She inhaled, breath shuddering, a tear rolling down her flushed cheek. "They keep me still, human. They're not just dogs. They are Mama and Papa, what's left of them. They are sleep, without nightmares. They are the arms, holding me when I'm too afraid to touch anyone else." Margaret Pierce dropped her pen, her shoulders curling inward as if her own chest was being torn open from the inside. All around the courtroom, people covered their mouths, tears slipping past fingers. No one, not a soul, could see Sophie now as a threat. Sophie stroked Ranger's neck, her voice suddenly hard as steel hammered from her own ashes. "Please, don't make them leave me. They're not dogs. They're my family. They're everything." A single tear slid down Margaret Pierce's cheek. The woman who had once sworn she was protecting the town's safety suddenly felt impossibly small and foolish before this tiny, trembling voice. Judge Mariana Ochoa held Sophie's gaze for a long, silent moment. She didn't smile. She asked no more questions. She simply nodded once, turning back to the clerk beside her. The court thanked Sophie Miller for sharing her words. In the corner, Ranger pressed his head into Sophie's lap, soothing the fierce thrum of her heart. For the first time in so many quiet, hurting days, Sophie had finally spoken for herself. The hearing ended with a shared breath that Willow Creek seemed to hold tight in its chest. Sophie had spoken, only a handful of words, yet enough to crack open every certainty Margaret Pierce once held about order and absolute safety. As the crowd trickled away from the courthouse steps, Margaret did not go home. She sat on the cold stone stairs, clutching her worn leather handbag, eyes drifting after dry leaves tumbling across the pavement. In her ears, Sophie's fragile voice repeated over and over, "Please, don't take them away," feeble, yet stronger than any petition. That night, Margaret barely closed her eyes. Walter, her husband, simply sat by her side, a steady hand on her shoulder, asking nothing. Spring had barely touched the wind. It cut sharp as she stood at the Miller porch, hand trembling as she knocked. Linda opened the door, startled by the hollow look in Margaret's eyes and the dark circles beneath them. From the shadowed hallway, Ranger stepped forward first, massive, dignified. He did not bark. He simply positioned himself between Margaret and the doorway, his stare asking, "Why are you here?" Behind Linda's skirt, Sophie peeked out, one hand clutching the fabric, the other sliding slowly along Ranger's back like an anchor against the storm inside her. Margaret drew a breath so deep it rattled her bones. Her voice broke like brittle ice. "Please, I need to speak to all of you." Henry appeared, eyes wary but resigned. Linda stepped aside, opening the door wider. Margaret sat down across from Sophie. Ranger never budged, the unyielding sentry. Margaret began, each word scraping her throat raw. "For years I told no one. The night of the accident, that truck wasn't a company truck. It was me driving it. I'd taken allergy pills. I was drowsy. I saw a deer, swerved, lost control." Linda's soft sobs fractured the silence. Henry bowed his head, fingers digging deep into the armrest. Sophie just stared at Margaret, wide-eyed, her palms sliding up and down Ranger's back in calm, steady strokes, comforting the dog or herself. Margaret's composure dissolved. She buried her lined face in trembling hands. "I let the police believe it was just an accident. I wrapped myself in this campaign to protect the town. All lies, every petition, every warning, just a muzzle for the ghost in my head. I couldn't stand looking at Sophie. Every time I did, I saw what I'd done." The living room held its breath under the weight of a guilt too huge for excuses. Ranger shifted closer, laying his massive head against Sophie's knee, golden eyes fixed on Margaret, not accusing, only calm, like an unspoken forgiveness. Sophie leaned a fraction closer, her eyes locking with Margaret's. No blame, only a slow, soft shake of her head, light as a drifting breeze, yet powerful enough to hush the storm that had ravaged Margaret's soul for 4 long years. Henry found his voice at last, rough but steady. "This stays in this house. From now on, you owe us nothing, but you let my granddaughter be." Margaret nodded. The last tear traced the back of her thin, weathered hand. She rose, the door swung wide behind her, and her footsteps slipped away down the porch. Slow, but lighter than the years of guilt left behind inside the Miller home. 1 week after that final, quiet conversation with Margaret, Judge Mariana Ochoa issued her official ruling. The document, crisp and stamped in red, carried the weight of closing an old chapter for good. Sophie Miller was granted the right to keep all 6 shepherds under regular check-ins from a certified vet and behavioral specialist. Ranger was now formally registered as a medical support animal. Word of this spread through Willow Creek, but no one gossiped or argued anymore. Those who had always supported Sophie smiled in quiet relief. Those who once doubted her simply folded their newspapers away and said nothing at all. Spring came swiftly, carrying the scent of fresh grass and birdsong dancing over the Miller house roof. Each morning, the attic window cracked open just enough to catch Sophie standing there. Sunlight braided through her hair. Below in the yard, Ranger sprawled comfortably, guarding her waking dreams with half-closed eyes. One mild afternoon, Sophie laced up her red canvas sneakers and lifted her hand. 6 shepherds sprang up in unison, forming their familiar line at her side. The old wooden gate creaked wide as Sophie stepped down onto Main Street, her head held higher, her stride steadier, her lips curling into a soft smile when someone called out her name. People in Willow Creek paused mid-lawn mowing, shut off idling car engines, and watched the tiny figure pass by with 6 wagging tails swaying in perfect rhythm behind her. They understood now. Scars might never vanish entirely, but this child was learning to speak again. Not just with her mouth, but with a heart stitched carefully back together. And along the sunlit cobblestone of a gentle April afternoon, Sophie Miller, for the first time since the storm that broke her world, truly belonged here. alongside Ranger and his loyal shadows, not just as dogs, but as family, as the living miracle of a life pulled back from the edge. They are home.